Hello, I am Dr. Ahmed Abdelal from Bridgewater State University. In this lecture, I'm going to speak about the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. Basically, the nervous system in general, however, the main focus will be on the brain. This is an overview, so I hope in just one video that I'll be able to give you an overview of the entire nervous system. So the nervous system is the system that is specialized in sending signals across the body, and it uses chemical and electrical signals to communicate with the rest of your body and to control your behavior. So imagine, for example, you have some neurons that have their bodies on the very top layer of your cortex. How can these neurons communicate with your toe and move it or wiggle it and so on? So you have to have a connection that goes all the way down to send an electric signal to your toe so that your toe can finally move. And the same way, if you get stung, like say something stinging you or feeling pain or some sensation on a finger, how do you get the signal to travel all the way through your arm to your spinal cord, to your brain, or to your brainstem, so that you can make sense of it. So that is one major quality of the nervous system, that it communicates with various parts of the body and controls their function. So the nervous system is divided based on two ways. First one is the anatomy, the structure of, the brain and the rest of the nervous system. So the anatomy itself, what does it look like? It's almost like a geographic map. And then the second way that we divide the nervous system is based on the function. So generally, anatomically, the nervous system has two major anatomic divisions. One is the central, which is the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral includes all the nerves that come out of the brainstem and out of the spinal cord. So that these nerves, for example, out of the brainstem, come out and control our facial movements and our facial sensations and neck and shoulders. And some of them go, down deep into the trunk and actually innervate most of the structures in your trunk. So the spinal nerves then come out and go to the different parts of your body and spread over your, say, for example, your arms and your legs and so on. So again, central means the brain and the spinal cord. And you could see that the brain is continuous with the spinal cord, as if it were like an animal with its tail. In terms of function, the nervous system is divided into two major functional or physiological divisions. The first one is the autonomic. And you could see from the name, autonomic means it's like automatic. So that part of the nervous system that controls functions that you have no control over yourself. You don't have voluntary control over your stomach digesting, or over your, for example, diaphragm contracting and going back up. You don't have control over your heart. So all these functions that we have, that we do not have control over, they are autonomic, and they are controlled by special parts of the nervous system that we know as autonomic, the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system has two two secondary divisions. One is called the sympathetic, and one is the parasympathetic. The sympathetic is the one that is like consumes energy. Whenever you think, whenever you do anything, you get to consume a lot of energy. So the parasympathetic is the one that kind of tries to calm you down, to conserve energy consumption. The fear response, which is sometimes called the fight or flight response or the stress response, that response results in, like say, for example, someone is afraid of spiders, and that person looks and suddenly finds a spider on her, clothes or hand or somewhere. And imagine how scared that person would be. So all of a sudden, their heartbeat goes fast, and their saliva dries, and their palms become sweaty, and they have that rush of energy, and they are threatened and almost like fighting for their lives. So all of this is causing burning of energy and causing the body functions to accelerate and the blood pressure to increase and all of this so that the person can deal with the threat. Now, the parasympathetic could kind of say, well, at least, you brushed it away, or you did this and that, it's only a spider, and then you start to calm down so that your system goes back to what it was before. So that is the parasympathetic system. Again, all of these autonomic functions you have no control over. Then we have the somatic nervous system, and that is the system that is dedicated to voluntary movement. And also that has two secondary branches. You don't have to worry much about that, but all you want to know is, basically that they control the voluntary initiation of movement, and there are two systems. One is called the pyramidal and one the extrapyramidal that connect the brain with the lower parts of the body so that you can have, control over the movements and fine-tuning your movements. So basically it's a motor and sensory system that is dedicated to control of voluntary movement, initiation and control of voluntary movements. So now we have again autonomic, which is in control of the body's automatic functions, and then the somatic, which is basically dedicated to movement and control and refinement of that movement. So let's look at the central nervous system. Now we are going to look at the brain and the spinal cord. So we are going to take it from the bottom, from the spinal cord, and then we'll go up. So the spinal cord these are the parts of the central nervous system. The spinal cord basically goes right below the skull. Right as soon as the brainstem exits the skull, the hole in the skull, that becomes the spinal cord. And right the part above the skull, that becomes part of the brain stem. So the brain stem that you see here has the medulla oblongata, and then the pons, this structure. And on top of the pons, you have the midbrain. See these cables? And again, think about the brain as that hard drive, basically. And then all these connections come together. And then out of that, you have one big, gigantic cable that's going to travel through the rest of the body. So it can send, you can send wires out of it and control the different, the skin and the inside and different parts of the body just coming out of that big cable. And information travels up through this cable and then comes down. So I want So now we have the medulla, the brainstem parts, the medulla, we have the pons, we have the midbrain. I want you to look at this picture on the right, where you have the cerebellum sitting under the cerebrum. So the cerebellum is supposed to be sitting here behind the pons, but it is cut. And you can see part of it is cut. That area here is basically a cable, we call them peduncles, coming out of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, as it goes out, it sends these big arms that basically they bring all the input from the cerebellum, and then these arms just go at some point, go around the brainstem, hug it, and go like this to make the structure that you see around here. That's called the pons. Pons means bridge. So it is the bridge that connects the brainstem with the cerebellum. Then on top of the midbrain, we have this structure. It's like the size of a bird's egg. And this structure is called the thalamus. There are two of them, one on each side. And you call the two of them the thalamic nuclei. Nucleus is a cluster of cell bodies that is deeper in the brain. So that is one, we call it thalamus, and two, we call them thalamic nuclei. And out of the thalamus, you do not see it here, there's a structure that goes down, and that is called the hypothalamus. You don't see it clearly in this picture, but I'll show it to you. So the thalamus and the hypothalamus make a particular part of the brain called the diencephalon. The diencephalon. It is almost like, it means like the brain with two parts, because it sits inside of the brain in the center. So the parts of the nervous system, the central nervous system, are the spinal cord, the brainstem. And the brainstem has the medulla, pons, midbrain, and then we have the cerebellum, and then we have the diencephalon, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, and everything else that comes above and surrounds these areas, like basically what you see here, is called the cerebrum. The cerebrum. And the cerebrum has different parts. So I'll walk you through, and tell you the different parts. And, it should gradually make sense. So let's go to the spinal cord. If you take one vertebra out of the spinal column, you are going to it will look like this. So this is the body of the vertebra, faces the inside of your body. This little spinous process here, this is like your spine when you touch it in your back. And all of them are aligned above each other, like here. And behind the spinous process, there is a canal called the spinal canal, or the vertebral foramen. The spinal canal here, that is where the spinal cord goes through. So it comes above, it goes through the vertebral foramen, or the spinal canal, the first one, and then goes down and goes down and goes down, and it goes all the way through to the very end of the spinal column. And that's the spinal cord. Because we have here, see these, the vertebrae that are inside of your neck. These are the cervical vertebrae, 7 of them. The piece of the spinal cord that goes through the cervical vertebrae is called the cervical segment of the spinal cord. The piece that goes through the thoracic vertebrae that make your thorax or your chest cavity in back, that are part of your thorax. These are called the thoracic vertebrae. 12 of them, and out of each one, 2 ribs come out, and then you have 24 ribs. Then the lower part, which is the lumbar, then we have the lumbar segment of the spinal cord going through. And then you have 2 other little segments. So it is basically called, divided into these segments based on the kind of vertebrae that it passes through. The spinal cord, as I explained, the functions of it is basically it serves as a large cable so that any sensation, any kind of sensory sensations that come, heat, temperature, pain, whatever it is on your skin, all over your body, is going to travel through, going up to the through the spinal cord. And then any motor movements or sensory feedback or anything is going to come down through the spinal cord. So it's for the control and for the initiation of movement and for sensory communication between the body and the environment. So that, whatever touches you or whatever you feel in your body inside or out is going to travel and go through these paths. So it's just a channel for conveying information. The spinal cord also controls some reflexes like your knee jerk. For example, there's an arch where the motor nerve is connected with the sensory nerve, and then connected with another nerve inside of the spinal cord, so that when the little hammer hits or mallet hits your knee tendon, that is going to activate right here, and then you jerk, your knee is jerked, your leg is jerked forward. So, and other things, like you would, when something, hurts you or something, you draw your hand away, withdraw your hand away. Even if you are sleeping, you get that reaction because the control needs to be quick and fast. It could be a life threat. So you want it to be controlled by the spinal cord rather than having it go all the way to the brain and the brain will decide and what is no. You just have that as a reflex. Reflexes are survival tools. So here it is. This is what it looks like. Vertebral, the body of the vertebra, and then the spinal process, and then the canal, vertebral canal, and then the spinal cord goes down, and out of it you have branches of nerves, that the spinal nerves, and they carry sensations in or bring motor commands out. You notice that it has gray matter, it has white matter, and all of that continues with the brain. So now, let's look, before we get deeper into the different parts of the brain, we're going to look at the outside covering of the brain. The brain is very soft. The consistency of it is like toothpaste. When you squeeze, toothpaste comes out. That is how the brain itself is like. So it needs to be protected. And so now we have the scalp. Beneath the scalp, you have the skull. And under the skull, you have 3 layers of protection. First one is that it is made out of 2 layers. These 2 blue ones are called the dura, or the dura mater. Mater, of course, as mother. So the dura mater, or the tough mother, is the outside layer, or the first layer of the meninges. The meningeal layers, or the meninges, are these 3 layers. So the first one from the top is the dura mater. Then beneath the second layer, beneath the dura mater, there's a space here. And that's called the subdural space. You hear about subdural hematoma. It takes place here. So basically blood, pools here, or injury causes blood to pool around here, and that pushes down on the brain, and that causes problems. So the meningeal layers, again, the first one is the dura mater. Second one is called the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid is because when you look at it under the microscope, you're going to find it almost like a series of spider webs. Very, very, like many fibers and threads connecting to the other parts of the brain, and little blood vessels and all of this. So it's called the arachnoid mater, and beneath it there is a space that's called the subarachnoid space. That is beneath the arachnoid membrane or the arachnoid mater. And then beneath that space is the pia mater. That is exactly, it comes in touch with the actual tissue of the brain, and it kind of covers it and protects it. It is soft and gentle, and this is why it is called the kind mother. So the pia mater. So now, what do we have? What are the meninges? Number one, the dura mater, and number two, the the arachnoid mater, and or sometimes called the arachnoid membrane. And then the third one is the pia mater. There are two spaces, the subdural space and the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space is filled with blood vessels all over, and also it has fluid. Fluid fills it, and it surrounds the entire brain from all sides, and it goes down to surround the spinal cord all the way down. And the spinal fluid is very important because it cushions and it serves to take out the waste out of the brain and the spinal cord, and then bring it to the bloodstream and then discard it. And it also serves to carry certain foods, large molecules and foods that can travel through the cerebrospinal fluid, and they can go to the brain. Also, it gives buoyancy to the brain and the spinal cord, so that it is as if the whole thing is in water. And it's like when you are in water, your body becomes less heavy. So the fact that we have the cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the brain and spinal cord, it makes them kind of buoyant, less of a weight, and you don't feel that as you're carrying 3 pounds inside of your head. So here is the actual tissue. You have here's the dura mater, and then the subdural space, and then the arachnoid mater, and the subarachnoid space. And again, see, the cerebrospinal fluid exists inside the subarachnoid space. Then we have the ventricles, or spaces that have that cerebral spinal fluid, that we spoke about, that is connected with the ventricles, and these serve almost like a series of rivers, so that the brain can circulate and bring in and out the fluids that are needed, and also take the waste and so on. There are we have the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle and the fourth, but you don't have to worry about the exact names. You just know that their function is to have the cerebral spinal fluid that again helps the brain and the nervous system do their function. So now let's look at the system beginning with the brainstem from the bottom, and we'll focus from now on. We'll focus on the brain by itself. First, the brainstem is the oldest part of the nervous system, and it is dedicated primarily to involuntary functions, to body survival. For example, the primitive functions of the body. It doesn't have much thought. Its role in thinking and all of cognition and this and that, it is, you kind of get it. It's not understood yet, but generally we know that the brainstem in general is dedicated to life preservation, dedicated to vegetative. So when you say someone is a vegetable or vegetative, that means that the brainstem functions to make their body alive. But they are not aware of anything because the cerebral cortex and the cerebrum itself, there's a lot that is not working. But the body can breathe, can digest, can do, the heart can beat, and all of these most of these autonomic functions are controlled here. Swallowing, breathing, heart rate, blood, regulation of, different senses here, like hearing. So, the brainstem has many centers that are dedicated to these functions here. And we'll touch upon some of them briefly, and especially when we speak about hearing at some point. Out of the spinal cord, there are 12 nerves that come, that sprout out. 12 nerves on each side, because the spinal cord, the brainstem, if you split it sagittally, like in the along a sling, then you can have left and right of it, and it's symmetrical. Whatever you have on the right, you have on the left. So you have 12 cranial nerves coming from one side on the spinal cord, on the brainstem, and then 12 on the other side. So in all, you have 24 cranial nerves. But when we study them, we just call them the 12 cranial nerves. Like when you go and, if you go and study the hand, you don't say, I'm going to study the hand. You say the anatomy of the hand, because what is here is exactly what's here. So this is an anterior view. This is a lateral view. And now you could see now the medulla, and you could see the pons, and you could see the midbrain. You could see the thalamic nuclei on top. And in here, you can see now this little structure coming down from the thalamus. That is called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus. And that hypothalamus has a gland that is hanging down from it. That is called the pituitary gland. It is basically a pouch where the hypothalamus produces hormones and stores them inside the pituitary gland. And these hormones are, for example, sexual maturation hormones, the hormone that controls the amount of blood, the amount of fluid in your blood, that controls also the function of the kidneys and makes them release more, urine, or release less, the antidiuretic hormone. So the hypothalamus here, I'm going to speak later about it, but it is dedicated primarily to involuntary functions, and it works well with the spinal cord and with the kidneys, the adrenaline system. So overall, the brainstem, as I mentioned, the brainstem generally, it receives, you think about it as cables. One series of, nerves brings sensation, like from the rest of your body, brings it to the brain, to the top of the brain. So sensory information travels up, that comes from skin and muscles of the head and the body, and also provides motor control. So you make motor commands here, and these travel down to the brainstem, and then they are sent either to your facial muscles or facial structures, or to your lower body parts. So sensory and motor. And in addition, these centers that we have spoken about for breathing, for heart rate, for digestion, for hearing, and so on. These are also part of the brainstem. And there is another system that is really important that spans along the brainstem. This is the system. It looks like a worm. See, goes all along, and it comes down, and it ends here. So it spans along the brainstem. It's called the reticular formation. The reticular formation. And that it contributes to your awareness, to your consciousness, your arousal, like are you up and awake and, or kind of losing it. So if someone has a car accident that affects the brainstem, and that possibly is going to cause coma, that structure is affected. And so it contributes to your sleep rhythm, regulation of your sleep rhythm and cycle, the circadian rhythm as it is connected with the lighting and all of this. So it's a very important structure. It's actually the oldest structure at all, of the nervous system. So now look at the medulla, the lower part of the brainstem, and it controls many autonomic functions like digestion, breathing, and heart rate. You could see the centers here, for example. The breathing centers here, and there are swallowing also centers. And then the pons, this structure here that I told you, basically comes out of as an extension from the cables, the peduncles that come out of the cerebellum. They travel, and then as you could see, this one is attached, the other one is cut. So, but they go around and they connect like this, and they make the pons. So the function of the pons is to relay information from the rest of the brain to the cerebellum, and also to enable the cerebellum to communicate and send information up to the rest of the brain and to the spinal cord as well. The midbrain, you can see here, it coordinates motor and sensory functions, including hearing. That little bulge has to do with hearing. The one above it has to do with vision. So also there are nerves that come out of here that have to do with vision. So you have visual functions, and also you have hearing, and then you also have integration of hearing with vision. For example, this structure enables you to finally locate a sound. When you hear a sound, say a rustle in the leaves in the yard, and immediately, what do? Immediately, without you even thinking, you're going to turn and look at that. So this enables you to locate the sound and the sound source, identify where exactly the sound is coming from, and then the other one that has to do with vision enables you to turn your head and your eyes and the gaze toward the sound source. Then the cerebellum, that is a little brain by itself. It's very small, and it has about 70 billion cells. I mean, it's huge. I mean, very, very condensed and very packed. And it communicates with the cerebellum, with the cerebrum in complex ways that we don't need to explain here. You could see on the side how the peduncles are cut. So, the middle, and then the inferior, and then the superior. But this one goes to the spinal cord, and this one goes up to the brain, and this one, the middle, is the one that wraps around. So generally, the cerebellum contributes to cognition, contributes to motor learning, and it contributes to cognitive functions as well. And even so, it has intricate functions, but in particular, people who play sports as they play very young, their cerebellum becomes so refined because it controls movements. For example, the cerebellum has a plan of the movement that you want to make. Say, you want to swing a bat. So before you swing the bat, your brain is going to make an image and a little video of the movement and plays it in the brain in different ways to measure and the accuracy and all of this. And then your cerebellum communicates with your legs and with your joints and with your hands and all of this, and it gets sensation from them, and it gets to see what kind of movement is actually happening on the ground. And at the same time, it has the map of what you want to do. So it compares what is the movements you are actually making with the map of the movement that you want to make, and it identifies any errors that you are making, and it gives you feedback so that you can correct your own movement errors. The diencephalon, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, these two structures again are called the diencephalon, and they process, the thalamus itself processes just about all the information coming from the various senses, and it serves as a gating mechanism, a sensory gating mechanism. For example, let's say there's a signal that you are hearing, and that signal comes up to that level as it goes through a part of the thalamus lower here, actually the medial genicle. When that signal comes here, if it is weak, then that part can amplify it up to 50 times, can make it louder by 50 times. So it gets, at the same time, if the signal is too loud, then it's gonna do something to refine it, to make it more subdued, and to make the effect less on you. So that is kind of, it reduces, intense signals that are coming to us. It gates them. And it also has functions in terms of control and refinement of movement as well, the range of motion. The hypothalamus, you can see inside of it now, it has several nuclei or several clusters of neurons. And you can see the pituitary gland here. It regulates primarily autonomic functions that you have no control over. It controls the functions of the glands in your body. And it could, like, say, sweat glands, the earwax glands, any, like, thyroid gland, different kinds of glands that you have, and also sexual kind of glands and organs. And it also controls visceral functions inside of your trunk. So, for example, when you see something that is threatening you, you immediately start to get into that fight or flight. So as soon as you see it with your eyes or feel the threat, the signal immediately goes to your hypothalamus. It goes to your memory center, it goes to your emotional center, but it immediately goes to the hypothalamus, and that hypothalamus is the one that releases the orders to your kidneys to make more adrenaline, to increase your blood pressure, to give you more energy, make you flushed and strong, and all of this. So that is where it comes from. It also has, through its communication with the inside of the blood vessels, it can tell how acidic your blood is. If there's too much water and less acidity in the blood than is required, it will allow the kidneys to release more urine, to take more water out of the blood and make it into urine and release it. If there's more acidity and less water, it causes you to be thirsty. So that is the center. And again, it has sexual functions, contributes to sexual pleasure, all kinds of autonomic functions. Lactation, like milk production. So now we are going to look at the cerebrum. Now that we spoke about all these parts of the nervous system, we speak now about the cerebrum. Notice the cerebrum is a big structure. Like I said before, it is all this structure that you see, including the, not including the Diencephalon. All of this structure here is the cerebrum, from the top to all the way to the bottom. So it makes 77% of the total brain weight, of course. It has more than 13 billion neurons by itself, and it has 60 trillion synaptic connections. It has gray matter and it has white matter, and the gray matter in the very top layer consumes about 94% of the oxygen supply that you have. So here is the cerebrum. The cerebrum consists of two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And each one has just about the same structures as the other. And between them, there's a big fissure that spans from the front to the way back, and it's very deep as well. So the two hemispheres are connected with a structure. You see it here. A structure called the corpus callosum. You see it here. Corpus callosum, or the callous body. Well, you can think about, again, the brain and the nervous system is all about communication. So you have one hemisphere. How do you make them communicate? You take all these cables, communications from all these neurons on one side, and bring all these neurons on the other side, make cables out of them, and then connect these cables together. Now you have almost like a bridge that enables communication across the two sides of the brain, of the cerebrum. You can see how it is here. So it's all about fibers or, wires that come from one side to the other. The right hemisphere generally controls the functions of the left side of the body, and the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, except for a few functions. But this applies basically to motor and to sensation, where you have the crossover of the functions. So what are the parts of the cerebrum? The cerebrum. First, the top layer of it, which is less than 1/4 of an inch, exactly 4 centimeters, the very top layer that is, all convoluted and all this, that's called the cerebral cortex. Cortex means tree bark. So the little covering that is 4 millimeters, that is the cerebral cortex. And its color is gray, because how it goes is you have the cerebral cortex, for example. Let's say it is like this. Let's say the thickness of it is like this. And now you are going to have cell bodies. Most of the cell bodies of neurons reside on the cerebral cortex. Most of the cell bodies. And then they send their little axons down, and the axons are insulated with white fat. It's called, the axons are called, that wrapping around the axons is called myelin, and it is white. So when you have the gray matter on top, and then, which means the cell bodies, and then you have down the axons, which are white like threads, as you could see here. Then this is called the white matter. What you are seeing here, all these fibers are white matter. You could see here these little margins, all this, 4 millimeters all around. That will be the cerebral cortex, and you can see the grayish color here. And then beneath all of that below is the white matter. You can see the split between, the fissure between the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. So you have the cerebral cortex, the very top layer of the brain, which is gray. We call it the gray matter because it has lots of oxygen and, glucose and so on. And then the threads that come out of the gray matter or out of the cell bodies go down. That's called the white matter because of the color. And then we have some structures that you see here that reside deep inside, below the white matter. And these are called the basal ganglia. Again, ganglion or nucleus is a cluster of cell bodies, and they live below the cortex, because I told you all the majority of cell bodies are inside of the cerebral cortex, the very top layer. But anything that you find beneath, you call it either nucleus or body. And then that means that cell bodies that exist below. And then, so the basal ganglia are 5 structures that are deep inside of the brain. And then the hippocampus, that is your memory center. I'll show it to you. It's around somewhere here. This is not a very clear picture. And then the amygdala, which is your emotional processing system. It will be usually around here. There are better. So here, you could see here you can see the amygdala, and here you could see the memory, the hippocampus. So we'll speak about this in just a minute. So the corpus callosum, again, connects the right hemisphere with the left hemisphere, and it is the biggest channel or the biggest cable that is in the brain. It connects right and left. Commissure means pathway. And again, it is all made out of white matter that's compressed, and this is why it is callous. And it carries information from one side to the other, and you really, the fact, what people were saying in the past, that there is a white, like you are a right brain, you are a left brain, these are all myths. You need both sides of your brain. So, and one side is dominant for certain functions, and one side is dominant for the other. And in order to have normal functioning, you have to integrate, you have to blend in the functions of the right with the left hemispheres. So the corpus callosum is very important for that integration of these functions. And there is a disorder called corpus callosum agenesis, or underdeveloped corpus callosum. It has a whole wide range of abnormalities. You can Google, you'll find many videos to show you what it looks like when someone has corpus callosum agenesis. The basal ganglia, these structures here, you don't have to know the names of all of them, but just generally these structures, they don't include the hippocampus but these structures here. They are 5 major structures. You can see them again here. All of these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then the substantia nigra here. 5. So these structures again are the ones, and they are critical for movement, for emotional control and regulation, and for mood, and they are important for learning and motivation. So they contribute to motor regulation, to mood and emotional states, to language and social pragmatic skills, social communication. They have three major connections with the frontal part of the brain, that part that we know as the prefrontal cortex, your control system basically, your, your judgment, your voluntary control system, and very, very self-regulation, executive functions, all are scattered here. So there are three major connections that connect that with the basal ganglia to control your social communication, to control your mood and emotional states, and to control movement and the range of movement and so on. So that is the system. It uses dopamine as a major transmitter, and if dopamine is depleted or there's some problem with it, the person will have Parkinson's disease. And also they will be having difficulty with motivation and difficulty with emotional regulation. Sometimes this is called the limbic system, that is, that includes other parts, the memory and other parts. So the hippocampus is part of the cerebrum, and the hippocampus is your major memory processing center. So that you can think of it like an airport, where people don't live at the airport. They come in from all different parts, and then they go in here and they are directed, go to this gate, go to that gate, and then, so it is like a distribution center. So all the information from your senses, any information that you see something, you feel something, you touch something, it goes to the hippocampus, that little structure. This hippocampus in old Syrian language is called, it means seahorse. So as the information comes into the hippocampus, it gets sorted out, it gets connected with the site in the cortex where it is going to be stored, and then it also communicates with the prefrontal cortex, and then it helps that storage and imprinting of the new information that you learn in the special areas along on the cortex. So then it doesn't hold the information. It only holds it for like an hour, maybe an hour and 10 minutes or something like that, until it is fully processed, and then it doesn't hold onto information for long term. So it's very important for creating new memories and for also retrieving memories that you have stored in your different parts of the brain. So now we have the amygdala right next to it, and that is your emotional processing system. It is very important for social interactions. If you meet someone and you are having fun with that person and having a nice time, that is going to activate the hippocampus and say, could you please, store this information for me in a special kind of folder, because I am really having a nice time with this person. And then also the amygdala itself has little pockets, like little areas where it keeps little memories of pleasurable social interactions or threatening things. So it has that little, like really direct control over the thalamus, the hippocampus. And any time the amygdala is activated, it is going to activate the hippocampus, and it will make it basically take in information, whatever comes along. So in highly charged emotional moments, whether pleasurable or threatening, then the hippocampus is highly active and ready, and this is why we remember these moments. We should remember every detail about these moments because of the control and the connections that the amygdala has with the hippocampus. And the hippocampus also does little tricks, like almost like, similar to like tagging information based on how important it is. High importance, send it into a file, make it ready whenever it is needed quickly, or, well, this is like, has a secondary kind of thing, so it may be important. So it tags information based on its importance and how readily you are going to need it. Just to mention a couple of things, as I mentioned before, the left hemisphere, right hemisphere thing that they used in the past as a business ploy and making all kinds of tests and all kinds of things, saying to people, you are a left brain, do this and do that, buy this and buy that, right brain. That is a myth. So you need both the right brain and the left brain, and the reason that each one is dominant for certain functions, it is a way so that you do not duplicate. Why, if you have half here and half here, why do you have to put the same structures, similar structures that you have here and here at the same time? If you have one section, one side, dominant for, say, certain functions, the other can also be dominant for different functions, and then you have more functions that you are able to perform, rather than having, duplicates. So the left hemisphere is dominant for phonological processing. It gets the sounds, recognizes them, connects them together, making syllables, making words. And also, it has syntax, the rules, the abstract rules of grammar that you have. And how we do that, how we understand grammar. When you look at it, say you take a sentence like, the cat ate the fish. So the cat ate the fish. You remember the pattern, almost like a musical tone. And the brain, when it hears this sentence, fires a certain number of, action potentials at a certain speed with certain gaps and all of this, and now that becomes fixated as a pattern. So when you say, the cat ate the fish, and then you change the and say, a cat ate the fish, that's the same structure, the same pattern grammatically. And then you say, the dog ate the fish, and then the dog ate the bone. And then all of these, you change the words, but the mold remains the same. And these molds become like musical patterns. They become systems, sequences of firings that are exactly the same for every sentence that fits in that structure. A noun, a or the, a, and then noun or subject, and then a verb, and then object. So then over time, these networks take any of these sentences that fit into that pattern, and then we recognize that, oh, this is the sentence, how it should be structured, how it is, structured. And that is how we learn syntax, by repetition of sentences of the same structure over and over and over. The left hemisphere also recognizes speech and also has analytical skills and math skills. And then also, and especially in the frontal parts of the left hemisphere, it enables you to detect lies and to also form lies. It makes you able to understand the intention of the other person based on what they are saying. It makes you kind of see if there's any falsehood or anything in what the other person is saying, and to, again, understand their intentions. The left hemisphere, right hemisphere, is more dedicated to holistic functions. Like in the left hemisphere, you have a story, you have sentences, one sentence after the other, connected together. And then the right hemisphere says, oh, there are so many relationships among these sentences. They're actually one story. So it enables you to look at the entire story as a whole piece and say, what is the moral? What is the theme of that story? What is the purpose of that as a whole? How is this paragraph connected with the next one, to make a whole thing? You look at a picture, you see it as a whole thing together, complete. So it enables you to make connected narratives, to understand connected narratives and stories. It enables you to process the tone of voice of someone else. And it enables you to, when you speak, to put the correct tone of your voice on your speech so that you can be more expressive. That's all in the right hemisphere. It enables you to understand the other speaker, to have theory of mind, to kind of get to know the perspective of the other person. So again, the global aspects, the whole overall meaning of anything beyond one sentence. The cerebral cortex, again, that thin covering, you can think of it like a thin pancake wrapping all around the brain. It is divided into 6 major parts. We call them lobes. I'm speaking just about the cortex, about the gray matter. So we have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and then we have 2 hidden lobes or 2 hidden cortices. So you can, instead of lobe, you also could call these the frontal cortex, the parietal cortex, the what they call it, the occipital cortex, or the temporal cortex. So cortex means lobe. So if we say then cortex, then there are 2 other parts that are buried, that are not showing here, that make the cerebral cortex consist of 6 parts. So we have 4 visible lobes, and then we have a structure here that is called the cingulate gyrus. It's not showing unless you take the 2 sides of the brain, the right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and open them up. So you can see this gyrus going all around here, called the cingulate gyrus. Cingulate means like unique, and it is by itself continuous. It sits on top of the corpus callosum right here. So that's the cingulate. And then there's another one that if you kind of open the temporal cortex, pull it down and pull up the frontal and the parietal cortices up, that area that is buried here is called the insula, or the insular cortex. So the cortex, the landmarks that we discussed, are kind of, there are major lines that kind of define, major boundaries that define these, that make this, for example, the frontal versus the parietal. So the first major boundary let's look at the landmarks. The first is the gyrus. All of these mountain-like, structures going up the hills, they are called gyri. One is called gyrus. Yeah. And the little fissures in between, these are called sulci. One is called sulcus, or when they are deep like this one, is called fissure. So that is the longitudinal fissure. So longitudinal fissure separates the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere. The central fissure, you can see here and here, and you can see it here between the blue and the green. That is the central fissure, right in the center of the brain. And It separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The temporal fissure, show it to you again here, which is that line between the temporal lobe and the frontal and the parietal, that here, temporal fissure. It separates the temporal cortex from the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex. The plural of cortex, by the way, is cortices. And then we have the parieto-occipital sulcus that you can understand, that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe between the purple line and the green line, right here. So now, let's look at these 4 parts that we discussed, 6 parts of the cerebral cortex that I have just discussed, identified. The cingulate gyrus, that green structure here, it contributes to analyzing your thoughts, especially the frontal part of it, analyzing your thoughts and rehearsing, the script of what you are going to say. There are people who have OCD and become so bad that their thoughts never stop. And they keep, like you lock the car and walk a few steps, so walk away, and then say, oh, did I lock the car? Oh, I didn't. What? And then you go run back to the car. Oh, it is locked. Then you go back again, walk. Oh, did I look? I didn't think I should have checked. And you keep going back and back. And your thoughts, or one thought just pops up in your mind that keeps spinning and spinning and spinning, and you can't stop it. In this area here, in the frontal part of the brain, this is where that happens. And there's some kind of surgery, I'm not sure if they still do it, but they bring in a tool and they burn a pathway that is, that's responsible for that. In here, they burn part of it to make it less to make the input of it less. And it tends to relieve the symptoms in some very, very serious cases. It contributes to mood regulation. And also in these 2 areas, in here exactly, there's one center here and one here, they contribute to movement and movement regulation. The insula, or the insular cortex, it contributes to motor speech production, and it connects to the, a major language center here. And also it has, it's like the central function, engine for something that is called the brain default mechanism that gives you intuition, that makes you kind of think whenever you are distracted and staring like this, you don't have a conscious goal that you are working on, your default mechanism immediately begins to be active. And it connects your unconscious, unconsciousness with your consciousness. And it brings up things that you might not have been able to recognize when you are thinking and, consciously, and then that flags them to you, and then you get intuition. So intuition is based on very sophisticated calculations, based on all the information in your brain, and then that little structure is going to say, you know what? There's a connection between this and this and this and that, and that means that this is going to happen. And then you say, oh, my gut feeling, this is going to happen. If all your information that you have collected over the years is accurate, then your intuition is going to be accurate. And the opposite is true. The insular cortex, it is a center that enables you to feel your emotions physically so that they become feelings. Emotions are unconscious things, but once you feel them, they become feelings. They become conscious emotions. And so, for example, someone might have a certain feeling, like they might listen to a story. And they are so moved by that story. There's that, person in the story faces defeat after defeat and calamity after calamity. And then you as listening to the story, you feel like, oh, like someone kicked me in my stomach. So it basically makes you feel your emotions in a physical way. And people maybe, become nervous and throw up, become nauseated, whatever you call it. That is the structure that connects your emotions and your feelings with your body functions to change, to produce a physical effect on your body. So the frontal cortex, that blue part, is it has this motor. You don't have to worry about the little structures, but this area here, that is your motor cortex, that is responsible for voluntary movement, and it has a map. See, we are speaking about that red structure. And if you take that structure here and slice it all the way down, you are looking at this structure here. So you can see now that's between the right hemisphere, left hemisphere here. And then you can see now here, as you go from here to here. So you can see the gray matter, which is the cerebral cortex. Beneath you see the white matter. So now that part that is between the two hemispheres here, it controls your toes, and as you go up your ankle, your knees, and all the movement here and sensation from these structures. Look at how much your hand occupies out of the cortex. Huge. Almost like 1/3 is dedicated to your hand. And then your face is controlled by this area here, and this is the eye. And then the nose, and then the mouth, and the lips, and the tongue, and the larynx. And so it has a map. That little map here where you have the man laying down, that is called the homunculus. So when you say the motor homunculus, it refers to that particular lobe here, gyrus here, because it has, the functions are mapped along it, and they control all your body functions. On the other side, on the right side, you have an identical homunculus, but that is dedicated to sensation. So, like you see it here, that is the sensory homunculus, exactly identical. And, for example, this area here is dedicated to the tongue movement in different ways. This one, it gives you sensations from the tongue, whether the sensation is bitter, sweet, or pain, or temperature, this and that. Here's the lips, and in this area, it gives you sensations of what the lips will do, how they will feel when you round them, when you say your sounds, when, whatever you do with your lips, then you feel the effect, or you get the sensation. So that's the sensory homunculus, and then the motor homunculus. The sensory homunculus, or the sensory cortex here, sometimes called the somatosensory cortex. That is part of the parietal lobe, parietal cortex. But it lies next to the motor cortex. So, and then motor cortex is part of the frontal lobe. So the areas in front of it are dedicated to planning, motor planning, and for example, motor planning. And then there is this area here in the front that's called the prefrontal cortex. And then in this area here, there's an area called Broca's area that is dedicated to language and motor planning for speech. So a lot of motor functions and motor planning are in the frontal cortex. I'm just gonna give you just a little explain a little bit about movement, and just to give you an idea of how this happens. So, for example, you have an idea, you are sitting down and you feel thirsty. So, this little structure here, the prefrontal cortex, gets the news. Coming down from your emotional system, I'm feeling uncomfortable. I need, to really get some water into my body. So what should I do? You are the decision maker here. What do we do? So that's, I guess we need to, and then it starts to imagine now and starts to make a script of the movement. So it's going to communicate with the cingulate gyrus, it's going to communicate with the motor cortex, with the premotor areas, and with the somatosensory cortex. And then the area here that is part of the parietal cortex. So this area that has a map of all your sensations and your body and space and orientation, all of this is going to be sending information to the premotor areas. And the premotor areas now are going to construct a simulation of the movement and several movements. Is it more effective if I walk around the chair and go to the fridge? Should I walk? Should I run? Should I, go around in the living room and pass by it calculates all the movements and it decides on the most effective movement that consumes the least amount of energy. So now it makes the map and it makes you kind of like playing it in video before you actually do the movement. And once it is done, it is, being coordinated with the prefrontal cortex. And then it is sent finally, after it is edited and refined, then it is sent finally to the motor cortex. And that motor cortex is connected with the brainstem and the rest of the spinal cord. And then the motor command goes down, and then you have along the path, also, some pathways from the sensory cortex coming down for sensation, and also the cerebellum. And then you go down now to your legs and your arm, your body, and all of this. As you start moving, then you get feedback from your organs. And that feedback goes, you are walking wobbly, you are walking too fast, you are gonna slip, this and that. And they are not, and the cerebellum edits your movements and sends input to the frontal cortex. So all of this sensory and motor are integrated so that you perform the accurate functions that you already, planned before and intended. And then the prefrontal cortex monitors. If it receives signals that there are errors, then it gives commands to go and say, no, correct. So that's just a general way of how, movement, for example, is performed, whether by your oral mechanisms or by your hands or your body. And you can see, you can see how these, the white matter makes pathways and tracks coming down will go into the brainstem. This is called the pyramidal pathway, major one for movements. And then as you could see in the medulla, the input from the right hemisphere crosses over to the left hemisphere, and the opposite is true. So we call this the medullary decussation, the crossover. And this is how, if there's a stroke, for example, in the right hemisphere, it's going to cause paralysis or weakness in the left, side of the body. And the opposite is true. So the premotor areas, as I explained, their role in the movement is to plan movements and construct simulations of these movements and choose send the most effective movement patterns that cost the least amount of energy to send them to the prefrontal cortex so that it can decide on, whether they should be used. And also that premotor area, it serves as a bank for the movements that you perform, so that when you do perform them next time, you are going to perform them better and you are not going to make more mistakes. At least so you have something to go back to. And it's important for also motor activation as well. There is an area here, and these two blue areas, but they extend. So here goes, it continues to go between the two hemispheres. That area is called the supplementary motor cortex. It contributes to editing movement, including speech movements or other movements, but it edits the movements before you do them, before you initiate them. Then the prefrontal cortex, that area here, roughly the green area, it is responsible for your consciousness, for your awareness and alertness, for decision making, for working memory, attention, your emotional regulation and control over your emotions, your decision making, inhibiting, language or language inhibition. Like someone says something bad to you, and then immediately you want to just go get back at them. Then you say, no, that is not appropriate, because if I get back, this will happen and that will happen. It is better. So you weigh your options and buy yourself time. So that is where you have inhibition. Also, movements. You want to be sitting and you control your movements of your body. So this is where hyperactivity comes from. This is where impulsivity or impulsiveness comes from. Lack of control because of this area here. It regulates motivation and it regulates problem solving. Social communication, because social communication is quite complex. It needs attention, and needs working memory, and it needs self-regulation, and you name it. So that is critical for social regulation. Integration of language and emotions and cognitive functions, all in this area. Now you can imagine with this, when someone has a car accident and the frontal part is injured or hit, you can imagine now what that will result in. And the person could be really, really strange. One of the things is that they could cry easily and become emotionally, easily be angry, and lose their control over their emotions. They say whatever comes to mind. They can be insulting. They can be, all kind of asocial behavior, and any of these things that should be performed normally, the person will have difficulty with them. Broca's area, it lies, see, this is the motor cortex, and in front of it here, there are the premotor areas, and then here, this area here, it's a little bit bigger, is called Broca's area. This area exists, the functions, in terms of functions, only in the left side of the brain. Even though there's a mirror image of it in the right side, only the left side has the grammar of the language here. And also it contributes to activation of the speech structures. So for example, your lips, your larynx, vocal folds, the facial muscles and so on, it contributes to motor activation. It is not active itself. No, it says, okay, this is what you will do, and this is, the script, put this word before that, use this muscle before this muscle, and all this 90 muscles have to work together to make one single word. How do you get them to all work together and in sequence and so on? So that is the area that programs motor commands, and then once it sends them to the area for speech control, then it is not active. So it sends and then stops being active. When this is done, then it keeps working. So it just programs. So it contributes to language comprehension, even though it's an expressive part. But if you want to comprehend, you need to think, comprehension is in this area called Wernicke's area. If you want to comprehend, you have to get access to the syntax. You have to look at the words in the sentence form and say, so this, and then as you have to integrate expressive language with receptive language to be able to do either one of them. So, when you speak, there's that motor script for speech. What do you want to say? And what grammar and what language and all this, you have to rehearse very, very quickly in your brain this script. And then you have Broca's area and Wernicke's area that is dedicated, to comprehension and recognition of speech. Both of these areas work together with other areas. So half of the brain will be dedicated to saying a single word. So, okay. The temporal lobe is primarily a memory and auditory and language comprehension and language recognition center. It also has functions for facial recognition, but mostly in the right hemisphere. It has areas, the motor cortex, there's one gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus, the medial and the inferior temporal gyrus. The medial temporal gyrus has the auditory cortex here that enables you to receive signals in the cortex and then interpret them and then connect them and then send them to the Wernicke's area here and the memory centers so that you can attach linguistic meaning with the sounds of a word. And now you have that word complete, send it to Broca's area and say, is that a noun? Is that a verb? Is this, a preposition? Whatever it is. So you communicate between Wernicke's area and Broca's area, because both of them are language functions. So it's the area here that temporal cortex is dominant for auditory processing, speech recognition, and comprehension of language. It also is dominant for memory and for emotional control. You can see the connections now here. There are two major pathways, and there's that hub area that's called Wernicke's area. That is the central component for sound recognition and combining sounds together and helping to combine them with meaning. So it is also critical for oral expression because before you say something, your brain has to rehearse it. What's it gonna sound like? And you can't understand what it will sound like or imagine what it will sound like if you do not activate Wernicke's area and the comprehension areas that have the sounds and the syllables and so on. So it enables you to monitor your own speech as well as you speak. Then you comprehend what you are saying, and that is going to tell you, no, you shouldn't have said it this way. You should have said it that way. The parietal cortex that area here is, again, it is responsible primarily for sensory functions. And it has the precentral gyrus, this gyrus here, that blue area that is part of the parietal cortex, that is the somatosensory cortex that I showed you earlier here. And you can see the little map of the man sitting to show you what area controls what structure. So that is the sensory homunculus again, and this is the motor homunculus. So these are the general functions of the parietal cortex, and you can read them, I'm sure. And so I don't want to make the video too long. So the visual cortex, when we say visual cortex, you notice I use, interchange. So that if you say visual cortex, you're looking at the function. But if you say the occipital cortex or occipital lobe, you look at the anatomy. Okay. So the visual, it receives visual information like from your eyes, and it stores them also. And there, it has like the neurons are arranged in a certain way so that some detect low speed motion and some detect fast speed motion. And if you want to trick them, you get these kids who make this, you know, they go like this. Do you see it? That is called, they call it twizzling. If you do it long enough, the pencil becomes only like a Twizzler. And the reason is you are tricking your visual, different parts of your visual system so that you switch between low speed and high speed, and then you get them functioning at the same time, and then you get the idea that the pencil now is becoming like a Twizzler. So it contributes, of course, obviously to reading. And also the parietal cortex here has a reading and writing, area here that's dominant for these areas. And I think that is it. So I hope that you can go back again to the video if you feel there's anything that, that you need to ask questions about. And you can go back if you feel that you want to hear it again, and so on. And we'll communicate with you and, you know, about it on Blackboard. Thank you.